welcome back. In this session, we're going to talk about the brain, some very basic aspects of the brain as it relates to stress and emotions, relationship, and attachment. I am not a neuroscientist. I am a social worker, okay? But Bruce Perry, who's one of my gurus, one of my mentors, says that if you work with children, you need to have a generalist understanding of the brain. I'm going to get you started with that. There's a lot of resources out there. You can get his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. You can get the book by, came out a while back, probably about 10 years ago, but it's excellent for understanding basic brain stuff, is by Robin Carr Morse. Ghost from the Nursery, and then another one of my favorites by Dorothy Otnow Lewis called Guilty by Reason of Insanity. Those are a couple of excellent basic layperson books that you can get to kind of enhance your generalist understanding of the brain. But that's all we're going to try to establish here is a generalist understanding. First, we're going to start with the amygdala. Your amygdala sits at the base of your brain, right above your brain stem. Your brain stem sits at the top of your spinal cord. Now, your brainstem and your amygdala are directly connected and interrelated because they help control your autonomic response system and some of your nervous system. What's important is that your brainstem is considered your reptilian brain. It's the first part of your brain to develop. So if you encounter a lot of stress in utero, if you're exposed to drugs and alcohol, if there's domestic violence, etc., you have a depressed parent, then there's a lot of brain stem level change and influence that is occurring. The other important part here, though, is the amygdala. The amygdala is your fight, flight, or freeze reaction in your brain. Now, the freeze reaction's only been added in the last 20 years. When I was in my first Psychology 101, all we talked about was fight or flight. But what's significant about that is fight or flight are not your initial stress reactions. Actually, your freeze reaction is your initial reaction. Your brain freezes first because of the overwhelming experience of stress, and then it decides whether to fight or to flee. Now, your first stress hormones originate from the amygdala. They go from the amygdala, pass through the pituitary, all the way over to the hippocampus. Now, as they go through this exchange system, this axis feedback loop, when your amygdala sends the stress hormones to the pituitary gland, it's supposed to trigger another aspect of your brain that sits along the pituitary called the hypothalamus. What's supposed to happen is within the hypothalamus, when it gets triggered by sensing the stress, it's supposed to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is the anti-stress hormone. Anytime you experience stress, you're supposed to have a counter effect, a counterbalancing effect called oxytocin. Again, oxytocin is the anti-stress hormone. We all have it. However, what's important is that oxytocin, the oxytocin response, is a learned response. So if you don't have a caregiver early in your life that's affectionate, that's attuned, that is able to give you attention, and to meet your basic needs in a loving and responsive way, then you're not going to develop an oxytocin response that is effective enough to offset the outpouring of stress in your brain. So again, I want to reiterate, the oxytocin response is a learned response. So what's supposed to happen is the amygdala sends out stress hormones, and again, this is a very basic generalist understanding. The amygdala sends out stress hormones, comes to the hypothalamus, which is supposed to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is supposed to calm the stress hormones before it comes over to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain which is supposed to begin to allow you to think clearly and also to have short-term memory. But this is important too. Your amygdala develops in your first 18 months of life. So by the time you're 18 months old, you have a fully formed amygdala. It's funny, I had a conversation in my spin class at the gym this morning with the lady next to me on the other bike. She was talking about having to leave early the other day from spin class because her little girl just seems to be having a harder time being in the little daycare center. And I said, well, how old is she? She said she's almost 2 years old. I said, oh yes, of course. It's because her amygdala is just now beginning to come fully online, and her amygdala is her fear receptor, so she's beginning to sense more stress and fear in her environment, and she doesn't feel as comfortable anymore. And the mom said, oh, that's really interesting. She said, what's also interesting is that she's really enjoyed going there all this time. She used to just run in. I said, exactly, because as her amygdala is coming online, she's beginning to experience more stress in the environment. Therefore, she wants to be able to come back to her primary oxytocin figure, which is her mother, sooner. I said, well, what you should do is you should go in between your lifting weights and between spin class and spend 10 or so minutes with her, help her to calm her little system down. She'll feel more regulated, more relaxed, more secure. Then you should be able to come in and finish your whole spin class. She said, well, I just did that today. And guess what? Mom made it through her whole spin class, and she had no interruptions. And so that's a great opportunity to just see that at 18 months old, you start talking about the terrible twos. It's because, children aren't terrible because they're two. Children struggle because their fear receptors and their stress receptors in their brains become fully online. Whereas your hippocampus, what's responsible for your short-term memory, so the part of your brain that is responsible for saying, calm down, it's going to be okay, mom's going to be back, remember she just came back last week, that part of your brain, your ability to think clearly in the midst of stress, it doesn't come fully online until you are 3 years old. 36 months before your ability to think clearly and begin to have short-term memory comes online. So all the time we're thinking about, well, why won't my 2-year-old listen to me? I just told him over and over and over again. Well, he doesn't have any short-term memory, and he's not able to think clearly. It's basic neuroscience. Now it gets even more tricky, because remember, your hypothalamus is a learned response. So your ability to calm stress is ongoing. It's developing. It's a process. You don't just have this ability to calm your own stress. You just don't have the ability for an effective oxytocin response. Now, what happens is that the hippocampus and the orbital frontal cortex are directly connected in a lot of their functions. Your orbital frontal cortex is considered to be your executive control center for your social and emotional relationships. I'll say that again. Your orbital frontal cortex that's at the front of your brain is considered to be your executive control center for all of your social and emotional relationships. So your ability to engage socially, your ability to be regulated emotionally, and to be in groups and be able to relate with other people and be able to have effective relationships and all that kind of jazz, that's all controlled by your orbital frontal cortex. Guess what? When does that part of your brain come fully online? When does that part of your brain reach full development? 5? No. 10? No. 15? No. 25 years old. Your executive control center for your social and emotional relationships does not come fully online until you are 25 years old. No wonder we have so many problems with our teenage children. It's because they only have half a brain. There's only half a brain, so, they're supposed to have the problems that they have. When you look at your teenager from this understanding, then instead of getting all mad because they act and do crazy stuff, just look at them and say, poor baby, you just got half a brain. I'm so sorry. It's going to come in time. Come here and let daddy look after you. Let mama look after you. Because they're not there yet. Their social and emotional control centers are not online yet. And not only that, when the amygdala is activated, when we are under a lot of stress, guess what we do? We regress emotionally. So you might have a 3-year-old who had a stressful early life, who, when stressed, reverts to a 12-month-old. You may have a 5-year-old who reverts to a 2-year-old. You may have a 15-year-old who reverts to a 3-year-old. You may have a spouse who gets upset and falls out on the ground and throws a tantrum and gets mad, and guess where he's at right then? He's a baby. He's a baby. Research says some adults in times of stress have the ability to revert to infancy. Was that not just your boss yesterday throwing that big old tantrum, acting like a baby? And what do we want to say? Grow up! Act your age, not your shoe size. Guess what? It's a biological reality, the reason he's acting that way. So I want you to take this basic understanding. You need to listen to it again. Remember, this is just an overview. I want you to review it again, and I want you to think about your child from the context of amygdala, fear and stress, oxytocin response, anti-stress, hippocampus, short-term memory, orbitofrontal cortex, executive control center for future relationships, social emotional relationships. Think about how that's playing out today in your life, in your home, with your child. And I'll see you next time.